Think Verizon is expensive? Think again. Anyone can bring their AT&T or T-Mobile bill to a Verizon store today and we'll give you a better deal. So bring us your bill. Walk in, run in, pogo stick in, teleport if you can. Ride on the back of a rollerblading yak or fly in on the wings of a majestic falcon. Any way you can, bring your AT&T or T-Mobile bill to a Verizon store today and we'll give you a better deal on the best network. Based on RootMetrics Best Overall Mobile Network Performance, U.S. Second Half 2025. All rights reserved. Must provide very recent postpaid consumer mobile bill in the name of the person redeeming the deal. Additional terms, conditions, and restrictions apply.
The future is something we make in the present, so we never quite know what it is, and things don't usually turn out exactly the way we expect.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
Things happen in unpredictable ways and don't happen fast, and often people give up too, because they don't have that understanding of how change works.
I had followed Rebecca Solnit for a while on social media, knowing about her brilliance in her essays and her books. And it just so happened that she was a featured speaker at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco when I was designated to be the preacher that day. So I got to hear her out there and got to meet her in person, and I knew that I wanted to have her on The State of Belief. An author, historian, and activist, Rebecca brings both passion and wisdom to the moment we're living in. And I'm really happy she's bringing both wisdom and passion to this show today. We need voices like Rebecca's to be heard now more than ever. So please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. Those things really help other people discover our show and become listeners too. Our library of past conversations includes well over 150 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, Jim Wallace, Reza Aslan, and many others. You can help us grow The State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. So find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get to my interview with Rebecca Solnit, I want to wish everyone a very happy Passover and a very happy Easter for all those who are celebrating. This is a time of possibility, of new beginnings, of what liberation can look like, what resurrection in the broadest sense can mean about rising up from a terrible time. And that feels very resonant with our situation in our country right now and in our world. And so I invite all of us to not lose fact of the joy of this moment. Even in the face of all of the suffering, all of the difficulties, find the joy that is in your life, wherever you find that. And let that also be a part of your daily practice, is to find that joy that can come from, if you are celebrating, the liberation, finding freedom, and also finding the power of love in your own life. So I invite you to think about this time and your role in the act of liberation, in the act of Easter, of resurrection, and also make sure you claim your own joy in this important time in our nation's history and in the history of the world. And now to my guest. Writer, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 25 books about the environment, landscape, community, art, politics, hope, and memory, including the updated and reissued Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities. Is that a good title or what? That book is a vivid illustration of the promise and the possibility of peaceful resistance for defeating authoritarianism. Rebecca's other titles include A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, and Men Explain Things to Me. Such a good title. Her latest is The Beginning Comes After the End, Notes on a World of Change. I am so happy to welcome Rebecca Solnit to The State of Belief.
Kind of lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, we met for the first time in person. I had been, following your work and also following you on Blue Sky, which you are amazing on. And then it just so happened you were the speaker of the day in the morning session, and I was going to be the preacher in the service afterwards. And I was like, wow. I can't wait to hear her. And then what you said that morning, it was like you were preaching this sermon. I mean, everybody later said that went incredibly together. And so I just want to say thank you for for all of your words. And I want to get into your book, but it's just so nice to be able to have a chance to talk to you in person.
Yeah, I was sad I couldn't go to the sermon because you were doing it upstairs as I was winding it down downstairs. But it's great to continue. And yeah, I'm an essayist, and there's a whole secular history of the essay that begins with Montaigne in France in the 17th century. And I'm always like, that's not the real history. Essays are sermons where you kind of meditate, explore, unpack what's in an idea, a sentence, a phenomenon, an event. And essays are sermons in some sense, although I think a lot of essayists would blanch at that, but I'm already too pale to do that, so here I am.
I think that it is true. Like, sermons are a way for me. It's, my husband, Brad, I don't think he came up with it, but we talk about writing as revelation. And you just, like, if you sit with an idea, if you sit with, what does this mean to me? And every time I have to preach, which is less these days, but it's always like, oh God, okay, I have to really think about this. But then things come and you're kind of like, there's almost a magic. And then you realize, oh, I do have something to say about this. And I wanted to ask you just to start out with, because your latest book, I think, is so important. What was the genesis of that book? Why did you decide that that's the book that we need right now?
I may be an oyster in that I so often start with a grain of irritation. And, I often, though I'm responding to something I disagree with when I'm writing politically, and always with something that I think I want other people to know, to think about, to pay attention to. One of the difficult things in our era, one of the reasons I think we're in the mess we're in, is people don't really have a baseline. And a baseline in the scientific terms is, what was this before it began to change? Without a baseline, you can't understand the change. You can't, organize against the change. You can't even recognize the change. And I feel like we live in a world that's changed profoundly in bad ways that people sort of recognize, whether it's climate chaos or the rise of the new authoritarianism. But they don't recognize, when it comes to the authoritarianism in particular, that it's essentially backlash against the way the rest of us changed the world to make it more equal, more inclusive, less violent, whether it was for nature, people with disabilities, queer people, women, immigrants, people of color, the very young, the very old. And so we're beneficiaries of a revolution nobody seems to notice. And how can you protect it if you don't notice it? How can you feel powerful if you don't remember your victories? So in some way, this book is about all the changes of the last 70 years, or the good ones, and the backlash, but is also just trying to equip people with a baseline, because I find even people our age, let alone young people, don't always remember how radically different, for example, the status of women was. And I'm old enough to remember, I was a kid when being queer was being treated as degenerate, mentally ill, or criminal, or all of the above, and being punished accordingly. And marriage equality was probably inconceivable when marriage was a strictly hierarchical, unequal relationship between a dominant husband and a subordinate wife. I actually think, this is a digression, but this is part of my gospel I'm preaching. Feminism, by making marriage a freely negotiated relationship between equals, made same-sex marriage more possible. Mm-hmm. And the opposition to marriage equality is the opposition to equality within marriage, as well as equal access to marriage. So we liberate each other, and these revolutions build on each other. These different forms of liberation or movements are all part of a great equalizing, great movement towards a kind of loving thy neighbor and being equal to thy neighbor, to get even more theological.
Well, I want to get into theology, but I really appreciated, there was a moment in your talk where you're like, is anybody in their 80s here? Is anybody in their 90s here? And there were a few hands that went up, and it was like, for those who are younger, you don't know what those people, the society that they were born
Yeah.
into. And I think that's a really important reminder. And in part, it's just a really important reminder that people can change.
People can change and whole societies can change.
Societies can change. But sometimes, like, if we even just take the question of gay marriage, which is obviously something really important to me and my husband. And, my husband came up, he's 74. And so, like, he came up and that wasn't even a conversation, let alone having children,
yeah.
and then AIDS hit, and it just was like existential and survival, and and so he just can't believe what has happened. I was just 10 years younger than him, or a little bit more, and for me it was more of a possibility. But like that, even those 10 years, so just for me reading your book and all the examples, and you go deep into it. This is an idea that you really tease out in ways that I think are inspirational. And so I just want to I'm going to say the name of the book so everybody gets it. The Beginning Comes After the End, Notes on a World of Change. It just gave me so many ways to enter into this conversation of how change can happen and the interconnectedness of it. That was a big idea of the book, wasn't it? That these things are not separate movements, but connected with the issue of climate, connected with the issue of people's liberation. All these things are not disconnected.
Well, there's two things that I think are central to the book, and thank you for going straight to them. One is the idea that all these different movements are connected in ways we often didn't see. And there have been times where they feel very balkanized and often, almost cancel each other out. People talk about race without talking about gender and vice versa, for example. And but I also was really excited to describe how each of these movements brings us to a world of interconnectedness, from a world of segregation, separation, compartmentalization, hierarchy, etc. In some ways, my favorite chapter to write was about Rachel Carson and Martin Luther King, who in weird ways are very parallel. They seem very different. White woman writing about nature, black guy writing about his own people's liberation, but also much more broadly about who we are and can be. But if you look at what both of them are saying, they're saying these things we are doing are wrong because everything is connected to everything else. Rachel Carson is saying, pesticides work to do what you intend, but they do all these things you don't intend because everything is connected. The birds eat the poisoned insects and they die, and then the whole, the rain washes the herbicides into the stream and the fish die and you get cancer. Everything is, both of them were preaching a gospel of everything is connected to everything else. And you look at all these different things, and a lot of them are about breaking down barriers. Women are not so different than men that they, do not have intellects and cannot go to universities and cannot hold positions of leadership and power and, learn skills, et cetera. And, same goes for people of color, that the world I was born into, I think I'm just a little bit older than you, was so segregated in so many ways, and everybody was supposed to stay in their little boxes. Human beings were supposed to be so separate from animals, and people, Jane Goodall kind of broke that down by saying chimpanzees have complex emotions, complex social relationships, they use tools, et cetera, but also human beings were seen just as so separate from nature, and that when I was young, both artists and environmentalists, the two communities I was around a lot, really talked about nature and culture as though they themselves were kind of separate and equal, and human beings were in culture. We were not in nature. And partly, I think, the rise of indigenous presence, power, participation, which is at the heart of this book, is one of the things that made it impossible to say that we are not nature, we are outside nature, we are independent of nature. We are nature, and we will never be separate from it. We cannot be separate from it. And that's another way that this book is a kind of describing a process of desegregation, of breaking down categories. And this world of interconnection, I think, is tremendously beautiful unless you're a Republican, unless you're the right. For example, part of their wrath at climate change is not only is it bad for the fossil fuel industry, which backs a lot of this from Vladimir Putin in Russia to a lot of Middle East tyrants, to the Trump regime, but the very central message of climate change is everything is connected to everything else. So everything we do has consequences. When we burn fossil fuel, when we cut down forests, when we do this to the soil, when we eat these kinds of foods. So we have to make our decisions in relationship to the well-being of the whole. Yeah. And that undermines that cowboy independence autonomy, which is ultimately a kind of tragic isolationism.
And a mirage.
Yeah.
You referenced this quote, the King quote, tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. That's such
That is so ecological.
It's so ecological and it's so theological.
Yes.
This is very rooted in his understanding of the beloved community, and that no one is outside of that realm. I want to hear more about the rise of the presence of indigenous liberation, indigenous presence in the American scene as a through line. But I do think, just for a moment, just to talk a little bit about how you understand the role that religion is playing. It's very evident to many of us, the role it's playing in kind of as the handmaiden of authoritarianism. But it also has this opportunity that I think many of us are seeing right now of being just a co-collaborator with democracy. Your book has these people who are driven by theological inspiration, but curious for you personally how that resonates.
I gave a talk a few years ago with Harvard Divinity School in that fancy church they have in the center of Harvard. And I was a little freaked out by the ostentation. And so I got up in this sort of golden eagle pulpit and I said, a Catholic, a Jew, and a Buddhist walk into a Protestant sanctuary. That's me. I'm a bad Buddhist, but a Buddhist. And, my Catholic grandmother and mother were born in Brooklyn and lived in Queens. But and I was just thinking about yesterday, a lot of the left will really treat all Christianity in particular as right-wing evangelical Christianity or Catholic sex scandals. Even when I wrote this book, one of the influences I thought was really important is non-Western ideas, which are really non-Western theologies in two senses. I think Buddhism has had a much bigger influence in this country than the number of people who would actually identify as Buddhists, whether they're of Asian descent and it's kind of a religion that was passed on, or they're people like me who found Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism, like Thich Nhat Hanh's Buddhism, although he's also Zen, influential. But also I think indigenous worldviews, which are definitely a cosmology and a theology, have been hugely influential on the rest of us in a remarkable way. And so I talk about those a lot in the book, but even since I wrote it, and I really only finished this manuscript about a year ago, less than a year ago, something remarkable has happened that I find beautiful, exhilarating, and exciting. For a lot of my adult life, with the moral majority and Ronald Reagan on, what's been really visible in American life is, the black church, of course, but for white Christianity, it's been right-wing Christianity. Looking at, King's marches in Minneapolis with our fabulous new Pope from Chicago, Pope Leo, I'm seeing a kind of progressive Christianity really showing up and standing up in the streets, trying to go into the ICE gulags to give mass and, minister to the people inside. So I'm really seeing a deeply humane, anti-authoritarian, progressive Christianity, and I feel like something incredibly exciting might be happening in this moment. I see in the protests we're taking back patriotism, the Constitution, and the flag, but we're also taking back faith. And if we do that, we've taken away a lot of the things the right pretended to have a monopoly on, and a lot of mainstream representation allowed them to. And I think that's part of the great change we're in the middle of. And this is a book about change, saying the world has changed almost inconceivably over the last 70 years. Somebody from 1955 or 1965 couldn't comprehend or believe the world we're living in. It's so unimaginable from the boxed up world of that era. But we're not at the end of the story. We're always in the middle of the story. And I think, feminism, for example, which is something I've been writing about for 40 years, is an attempt to change thousands of years of patriarchy and inequality. The fact it hasn't completely achieved all its goals and that everybody hasn't come over all the way in one lifetime does not mean it's failed. It means It's just getting started.
I think that.
I think the change is almost getting more extreme, which is also why the backlash is getting more extreme. And one point that's really essential to this book, what the right is doing is backlash. They want queer people back in the closet, women back in inferior positions, and exclusion from corridors of power, etc. They want racial inequality. They want to pretend we don't know we're connected to nature so they can ravage it without limit. So, and that's all an attempt to go backwards.
Yeah, I at the inauguration when Trump was saying we're in a golden age, I wrote a piece that day about, I think we realized what Make America Great, actually what era they were talking about, which was the Gilded Age. And, going back to actually the late 1800s where tariffs were ruling and all of the, and this Gilded Age.
Grotesque inequality.
Grotesque. I mean, before anything, we just had 5-year-olds working in factories. And I just finished a book. I wrote a biography of my grandmother, who's Louis Brandeis' daughter. And she was one of these incredible women in that era. There were these kick-ass, excuse my French listeners, kick-ass women who were didn't have the right to vote.
Yeah.
And that they were marching into these factories saying, no, we're going to work tirelessly. And I think you mentioned this. The terror and the terribleness of that era did give rise to what happened with the New Deal and the idea that we can actually create a society that is more equal, imperfect, but moving towards something. And I think that's what I really liked about this book. You have this beautiful passage that I actually had written down and then I lost it, but it was about you're walking on a path, but it doesn't mean that there's a destination you're getting to. It's that you're creating the road as you go.
Quoting Antonio Machado, the great Spanish poet, "Walker, there is no road. The road is made by walking." Because also one of the great problems with trying to achieve anything, literally I talked about climate a few years ago and somebody said, why should I do anything when I don't know what the outcome is? And I was like, if that's your basis, you would never go on a date and never have a kid.
Right.
Which are things people tend to do. It's not trying to be cruel, but I'm a huge fan of indirect consequences and recognizing, and this is very much what Hope in the Dark, my earlier book, is about, coming to terms with uncertainty. The future is something we make in the present, so we never quite know what it is, and things don't usually turn out exactly the way we expect. And sometimes we try and elect a mayor, Mamdani, and then Mamdani gets elected. But a lot of other things happen in unpredictable ways and don't happen fast. And often people give up too because they don't have that understanding of how change works. And you mentioned women voting. It took 80 years from American women deciding they should have the vote to them actually getting it. Well, almost 80 years, about 75, from 1845 to 1920. And a lot of stuff, we don't have time to get those immigrants out of the gulags to stop burning fossil fuel. These things are urgent, but everything we do is worth it.
Yeah, and connected.
Everything we can do on those fronts.
I think that there is such an opportunity here. Up next, much more with Rebecca Solnit, and you'll want to keep listening for her take on how everything is truly interconnected right now. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And don't forget, you can tell Alexa, Gemini, or Siri to play the podcast, The State of Belief, on any enabled device. Make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is best-selling author, historian, and activist Rebecca Solnit. I want to give you a question from one of my younger teammates, just out of college. Her name is Eden Min, and she is so awesome. But when I said I was interviewing you, she was like, "Oh my God, I love her. I studied all her books in college," and and so anyway, I was like, okay. But she wanted to ask a question, and so I wanted to convey the question to you, which was a really kind of really hard question, so you can answer it.
I'm ready. Bring it on.
But her question was essentially, we are people of stories. We are human beings, are people of stories. And right now, we do have, and we're going to go back, this is going to be a religion question because that's what, our framework, but we have people on the left and on the right in Christianity, we'll just leave it with Christianity, who are actually using some of the same stories in radically different ways. How do you unpack that? Where is the location of the story then, when you can have literally ICE using "Blessed are the peacemakers" on the recruitment ads? And then you have, like you mentioned, many of us who are really understanding Jesus in an entirely different way and his words in an entirely different way. And yet, So I think the question she's trying to discern is where does the location lie of the story?
And I think, again, coming to terms with uncertainty, a story can mean different things, which is why understanding how to interpret is really important. I taught in art schools when I was younger and had to come to terms with the fact that most people getting MFAs were not going to make a living as an artist. So what was I doing? I was teaching seminars, not craft things. I don't have the manual dexterity, etc. I'm not a visual artist. And I thought, what I'm teaching people is to become producers of meaning rather than consumers of meaning. And so I think that one way to look at it is behind the story is the values, and that you can take a story. We've even seen J.D. Vance try and take "love thy neighbor" and somehow pretend that there's a hierarchy, and that you love the people most like you and closest geographically, ethnically, politically. And I think J.D. Vance in 100 years may be remembered as the only person ever been told that he's deeply, profoundly, disgustingly wrong by 2 popes in one season, because you don't get to kind of parse and chop up and slice and dice to support your racism and your prejudices and your anti-immigrant violence. Love thy neighbor. It's a very simple instruction, and you don't get to complicate it. So sometimes I feel like the stories are disingenuous. Shooting people in the street is not peacemaking. Terrorizing a huge sector of the population is not peacemaking. Tearing parents and children apart is not peacemaking. So there's a kind of almost 4chan, overly online, sarcastic, ironic, nothing means anything. And I think one of the crises of our time that Trump has really led and embodied is, I was talking about everything is connected. He is the high priest of everything is disconnected. Words no longer relate to realities, facts. There are no facts. And somebody described his press conference on Friday about the war in Iran, and it's 12:04 p.m. It's a victory. It's not a war. We're in the middle of it. We're at the end of it. It hasn't started. We're winning. We're going to have a meeting. There is no meeting. There's a kind of nihilism of meaninglessness, and to call people armed thugs, heavily masked, breaking into cities, like dropping into buildings, terrorizing people, sending them to gulags, sending them to hideous prisons where they're denied all their human and civil rights, fed foul, rotten, contaminated food, not enough water, denied medical care. That ain't peacemaking.
Yeah, I think you said
you
like
can
it's
say
values,
the same thing, but sometimes it's a lie.
Yeah, that you put the values, you come with the values, and then you take the scripture. And I think that is like, I think that's absolutely right. And you see the values. Whenever I tell people what I do with religion and democracy, and in this moment, they're always like, "You must be busy," and it's absolutely true because we're kind of in a fight for like the pillar of religion, the pillar of faith, like what does it really mean right now when Trump is saying, kind of flipping the Lincoln saying, which was like, I hope to be on God's side. He's like, he literally has said, God's on my side.
Yeah, well, we know who's important in that sentence, and it's not God.
Exactly. A divine mascot, as I say.
Yeah.
But I think there is something really interesting. We were talking earlier about this idea of like democracy and the theology of democracy and the demos of it. What I try to connect is like when we say loving our neighbor in a democracy, it really means that we're choosing one another.
Yeah, and we're recognizing that we're already connected. One of the most powerful passages in this book is Judith Butler. They say that the best argument against violence is that when I do violence to another, I do violence to myself because we are not separate. And and that's a theology. I don't think Judith Butler thinks of himself as a theologian, but but I think democracy, all men are created equal, is a theological statement. And I think there's a lot of stuff in a lot of religions. I think you can find it in most religions, that every part of a system has value, that all of us have value in God's eyes, or that we're all connected. And a lot of that harm is done partly by othering, demonizing, pretending these people aren't human or they're terrible humans, and also creating these airtight categories. All people of this color, kind, ethnicity, religion are like this, and they're not like us, and we can punish them. But I do, let me just jump back. There was a video at the beginning of Occupy Wall Street where an old woman looked into the camera and said, "We are fighting for a world where everyone matters." And I think I just said, all men are created equal is clearly theological against the theology of aristocracy and monarchy. And if you take it to its logical end and you make it include women and all human beings, which was not how people talked then. Well, some people did, like Mary Wollstonecraft, but never mind. But if you take it to, if all people are created equal with certain inalienable rights, then to allow some to starve, to abuse some, to force children to work in factories, etc., is to violate that equality and those inalienable rights. And people really think, just the same way they thought culture and nature were two separate little boxes that didn't intersect. People really think theology is something in a tidy little box over there, and you can plunge into it or you cannot. One of the things I really like that I learned both from indigenous and postmodernist sources is that there is no place outside a worldview, and a worldview is a cosmology. A cosmology is essentially a theology. You may not want the theos part, the God part, but the ology, the belief system is there. And it really behooves us all to know what our belief system is, because a lot of people haven't really examined them. And if you believe in democracy, then everybody matters, and you're fighting for a world in which everyone matters, to make that world in which everyone matters, everyone's created equal, everyone has those rights. And I think that's in feminism, that's in the civil rights movement, that's in the disability rights movement, that's in the fight now for trans kids to be able to live safe, free, dignified lives.
Right.
And we don't want it in a sense of where there becomes an official theology and you become a monotheistic country. And we've often pretended it's not theology. to have room for the diversity that makes, the e pluribus unum. That's one of the things I love about this country that I think the right has to recognize. Before it started to say, "In God we trust," that right-wing 50s Cold War motto on a bunch of our coinage and currency, it said "e pluribus unum," in many one, which I think is a radically beautiful idea, an ecological idea, a racial integration idea, an inseparability idea, as we say in Buddhism, a dependent co-arising idea that everything exists in relationship to everything else, maybe even an Indra's net idea to go deeper into Buddhism, the idea that, each of us is a reflective jewel reflecting the rest of the universe. Each of us is a node on an infinite net. And,
I really love that you're mentioning that, because that's one of the things I almost as a benediction I've been using is e pluribus unum, keeping that in front of us. I want to be a part of everyone else here. I want us to recognize that. Just in my family, there's been, there have been theologians, there's been lawyers. One of my cousins, he was a philosopher, and then he became named Richard Rorty, and he became
oh my God, what a family!
He became very interested in really poetry and the arts. And you've mentioned the arts several times, and I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the role of the arts, because I think also when we think about what we're doing in the streets and what we're doing with, Interfaith Alliance and all the people we're working with, we love the idea of just incorporating all of it into it. That it's not where we're just well, here's the scripture and let's do that. It's really seeing all the resources we have for coming together as a people and learning about one another and growing in respect and dignity for one another. So how do the arts fits into this idea of, the end of one thing, the beginning of another, but this book, but also just your own well-being?
And I talked about teaching in art schools and realizing that not everybody would become an artist as an economically viable career, but these seminars I was teaching were part of helping people become producers of meaning rather than merely consumers of meaning. In some sense, everyone is an artist. The radical German artist Joseph Beuys had that as a motto, and I just love it. And so then I think about young people a lot. We treat being in your teens and 20s as though it should be a big party because you're young and nubile and can sustain a lot of drinking or whatever and partying. But it's actually this crucial era in your life where you're committing the biggest, most creative artistic endeavor anyone does. You're creating a self, a life, a value system, a community. You're deciding who you are, who are your people, and where you want to go with what you've been given just in having a mind, a body, a heart, a capacity to do things. What are those things you're going to do? So that's one sense. Another sense is the sense of stories and understanding stories. I would love to tear down what people, I will not be appointed queen of the universe, so this doesn't really matter. But I wish people were taught the kind of critical insight to be oh, that story tells me I'm worthless and helpless and I need to wait for someone to free me. And this story actually tells me I'm powerful and free and can do this thing. This story tells me I have intrinsic value, and this one tells me I need to have a better body. I want people to have those skills, the critical skills, the fact-checking skills, because we're also being inundated, thanks to the oligarchs of Silicon Valley, and a lot of evil players in that system, with a lot of disinformation and misinformation. So I think that, and then there's much more literal senses of creativity, of not separating it from politics. My younger brother David moved out of being a more conventional organizer into being an arts organizer. I joke that I have more words than him. I've written a lot of books, but his are bigger. If you need a 300-foot banner, he's your man.
Nice.
He makes a lot of the street murals, banners, signs, etc., for Bay Area movements, but also with Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and making
amazing.
There's no reason why a protest shouldn't feel more like a carnival and less like grumpiness. Because the old it felt like the left a while back, it was very much this kind of grumpy, we're angry and we have really ugly signs and you don't really want to join us because we're so grumpy.
Well, I actually think
And
No
now
Kings has done a good job of that.
it's been great.
My husband wrote a big biography of Keith Haring. And
Yeah.
he has, all of these images of the, of the ACT UP was, Keith Haring image. But he also, everywhere he went, he was like, public art is for everyone. And I just think that as we think about this world that, we're in a backlash moment, but we're already creating something new. And that's what I think is really important. Like we talk a lot about, we're not just in a resistance mode. We're actually in a visioning mode. Like, what is our vision? And I think we do have one. I think people, I try to, people, I think they think I'm delusional when I talk no, I'm actually kind of excited about this moment and what's possible, even with recognizing all the harm, recognizing terrible things are happening. But what can we do now? And I think that's what I felt like you had that energy about let's look backwards to project forwards.
That's one of the things I wanted to do with this book. I, like almost everyone else on Earth, is really locked onto, like a rabbit watching a snake, what the hell is going on with the Trump administration and the other big threats. But you got to back up from that sometime to see that in a lot of ways we're winning. And the U.S. is also only 4% of the global population. I got told things like, oh, Roe versus Wade being overturned means feminism failed, right? And I'm like, Spain, Ireland, Mexico, and Argentina all liberalized reproductive rights, made abortion legal, and we are not the world. Only 30% of American women have completely lost abortion rights because it's state by state, and it ain't over. I don't think, you can take away a right, but you can't take away the belief in that right. Yeah, so there's so many ways to tell the story. So yeah, I wanted to give people this bigger picture, and I do see the right as a backlash. I say, if you listen hard, the right is telling us 5 things. The last 2 everybody hears. The first 3 are really important, though. They tell us, you have changed everything. All those different things you're doing are connected. You are very powerful. Those are not easy to hear from, not clear. I'm not sure why. They're clear to me. The things people do hear is, we hate them, we want to change them back, whether it's environmental protection, voting rights, equality, etc. And but I look at all these young people, and I'm just sort of almost intoxicated to be in a city headed by Zohran Mamdani and partially represented by AOC. And the world you and I were born into, let alone our grandmothers, could not have imagined, these people being with this kind of power and this kind of vision. I see, and I'm very ashamed to say I'm on the very edge of the baby boom, although, and I try not to be one of those people who's like, oh, young people today are so. I find young people so exciting, and to see people who are born in a kind of freedom that I wasn't, and a kind of equality I wasn't, a kind of possibility I wasn't. I'm so excited about Afro-utopianism and, Latino. There's a new kind of young cultural movement to imagine your story being at the center of the world and not the margins, to imagine utopias and not just dystopias, to imagine freedom and winning and not just losing. And there's just such a skillfulness I see in young people. This may not be who you think about with politics or theology, but like the ice skater Alicia Liu from Oakland, to look at a 20-year-old woman who has such a clear sense of who she is, who she can be, such a sense of her rights and agency and identity, who, not like so many young women athletes, is not somebody else's, is not being controlled and pressured and really exploited by somebody else. To see somebody be joyful and free out on the ice like that is one of the ways. But I see, and it's in my next essay, I'm seeing so many, mostly young people, mostly people of color, some of them queer, just expressing this goodness, this freeness, this generosity, this connectedness. There's a wonderful line that I quote in the book that's really from the Prague Spring and the 60s, but it really applies to this moment. and maybe this season, you can cut down the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. The Trump administration authoritarianism is cutting down the flowers, but they can't stop the spring. And the spring, I think, is this global vision, because it's not just this country, it's not just the English-speaking world, this global vision of a more equal, inclusive, interrelated world.
I love that. I'm like literally writing that down. You can cut down the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. And actually, we're gonna this show is gonna run around like the time of Passover and the time of Easter. So you're on theme for that amazing.
Yeah. Well, I guess Easter is the ultimate. The beginning comes after the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And every Holy Week, the fact of Good Friday and the crucifixion, you have to recognize the crucifixion doesn't go away just because Easter happens.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, we're all done. It actually, but I wrote a children's book called Together We Rise, which is about like.
That sounds very Cleve Jones to me.
You know what? It wasn't.
His book is Still We Rise.
I know. And I read that book, by the way, because Brad was sent that book. And so I read that book. It's Together We Rise. The idea of Jesus' resurrection is actually a communal affair. But it doesn't mean that the crucifixion doesn't happen. And I think we're in that moment where both those things can be true. And yet there is a hope for it. One of the things that we've been just, inviting people to leave on is some just musing on the word courage and like how you see that manifesting itself right now. And what does that mean to you?
Well, a wonderful writer friend of mine, Michael Sims, pointed out that inside the word encourage is the word courage. And then you can go further. Inside the word courage is French cœur, or heart. And I write to give people encouragement, which is often seen as kind of nice and sweet, but courage and hope, I think, are related. This is possible. I can do it. And that also saddles people with responsibility. If you have the power to save someone who's drowning, you better save them. You now have moral responsibility. And I often think that for relatively comfortable, safe people, all that doomerism, despair, cynicism shucks off the responsibility to act. And I'm handing it back to them whether they like it or not. And I often see that actually the real courage is the front lines people who know that if they surrender, they'll be refugees, exiles, landless, stateless people. They'll die. They'll forever be unfree. The terrible thing will just continue. And I take a lot of my encouragement from seeing frontline communities, whether it's South Pacific Islanders facing climate change, the Zapatista uprising, and indigenous peoples across the Americas, who centuries into an attempt at genocide refused to abandon their culture, and right now are reclaiming land rights, ceremony, language, identity, and becoming really important leaders in the climate movement and beyond, and sharing their vision of a world of interconnectedness and reciprocity. So I think encouragement is everywhere, and you get to choose it. Because the other thing to say about the stories from your student's question or the young woman's question is we get to choose our stories. And there are discouraging and encouraging stories, and the discouraging ones are often seen as very suave and sophisticated. When I wrote Hope in the Dark and I went on, in the Bush era after the Iraq War and other terrible things had begun, including an attack on civil liberties and an attack on Muslims here in the U.S. that people don't seem to remember because it was 20-something years ago, I started saying hope is a frilly pink dress people don't want to be caught don't want to be seen in. Despair is a black leather jacket everyone thinks they look cool in, because people think hope is naive. But often, I wrote a whole essay about naive cynicism, we have no power, it'll never work, we never win. I can knock all that down. I have the histories, I have the stories, I have the heroes that prove it. So I also think encouragement and hope are really related. But I also think encouragement is our job. in the sense that Ram Dass once, or probably said many times the same way Martin Luther King talked about the single garment of destiny many times. He said, we're all just here to walk each other home, which I think contains both the responsibility of encouragement, you can get home, we can keep walking, and the sense that we're neighbors. We're here. What are we here for? We're here for each other in the sense we say to somebody we care about, I'm here for you. And as a writer, as a storyteller, as an interpreter, I'm here to interpret the stories in a way that remind people sometimes we win. We do have power. We have a history of victories. We have a lot of people worldwide who agree with us. We can do this.
Rebecca Solnit is the best-selling author of books like Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities, and most recently, The Beginning Comes After the End, Notes on a World of Change. Rebecca, it has been a joy to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being here on The State of Belief.
What a pleasure. Thank you.
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this discussion with Rebecca Solnit? Please share The State of Belief with them and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to continue growing The State of Belief, so please consider making a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.